our American culture it elevates and values things like compassion, but that's true only because of the teachings of Jesus that we see 2,000 years later, that we see the teachings of Jesus, ideas and concepts like love your neighbor as yourself and the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Those were not first century mindsets.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Sandy Laws, and I'm very excited again to continue our conversation with Curt about Jesus, the story about how he loves us and how we love him, and what we find about the subject of love in the Gospels and in the stories about Jesus. And Curt, just welcome again to the podcast. I have a question for you I wanted to start out with this morning. All right. So obviously the story of Jesus is big. As we talked about last time, there's about 350, 370 stories about Jesus in the four Gospels. If someone comes to you, because you're the pastor of a church, and says, where should I start in my journey with Jesus? How do I learn more about him? Where should I start? How would you answer that question?
I'm definitely pointing them to a gospel, and it's going to really sometimes depend on the conversation with that person on which gospel to pick. You obviously got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I love John partly because it's different, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to send somebody to John. And so I think it's a brief conversation with that person and trying to figure out some of kind of where they are and what their leanings might be. And then it's definitely starting with the gospel. And I think that all four gospels are incredible and tell this real story about who Jesus was and who Jesus is and what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And definitely what we're talking about today, of Jesus' love for us and our response, how we can also love him. So it's going to be a gospel. I'm not sure which one, depending upon where that person is, but it's definitely going to be a gospel.
I mean, do you pick it based on, what do you pick it based on? Like, if they're talking to you, what leads you to John versus Luke? I would point him to Luke, but that's probably more my personality.
Yeah, it just depends. They're obviously all telling the same story, but they all have a slightly different bent and feel to it. I think Luke is definitely a go-to for someone that wants to see that. I mean, the way that Luke starts it out, I've talked to eyewitnesses and I've researched and I've studied. So Luke does a really good job of naming places and names and kings at the time period. So I think Luke is a great account for it. But then John's obviously going to focus on the deity of Jesus, and it's just a different perspective. Mark is just shorter. So sometimes I send people to Mark because if they're brand new and starting out and they don't like to read, they'll get through it a little bit faster. Matthew's the longest. Matthew, if someone has a Jewish background, Matthew does a much better job. It's really written with kind of that angle to it. It has Jews as an audience in mind. And you can even, if you look at all four Gospels, if you just look at the genealogy, you can kind of see a little bit about what the book is about. So you've got Matthew and Luke that both have a genealogy because they talk about the birth of Jesus. And there's books and books and so many things written about the four Gospels. But you've got Matthew that really puts him in this angle of a king. And so like his lineage goes back through King David. That you've got Mark that really looks at him as this suffering servant, and so he has no genealogy because as his servant in the first century, a servant wouldn't have had a genealogy. And then you've got Luke that is really this perspective of Jesus being a man. And that's not to say that you don't see the deity of Jesus, because it's very clearly there, but you see his genealogy goes all the way back to Adam, the first man. And then you've got John that has no genealogy because in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, because his emphasis is heavily on that Jesus is God and has always been God. And so they're just all subtly different. I mean, I think that's the beautiful thing about the Gospels, is that there's just such a depth of the different perspectives.
And each one was an author with their own idea of what to include and what to cover and what they felt was important in putting in there, and their own style of telling the story, as you say. So yeah, there's just a whole wealth of information about Jesus when we take the time to go through it and talk about it.
Mhm.
Well, last week we started with some great stories about Jesus, and I kind of kicked us off last week. So I thought that you should start this week by sharing the first story you want to talk about Jesus and the story of love.
Sure. The first one I've got is out of Luke chapter 7, and it's a famous story, but I don't know that it's they're all famous stories, right? There's stories
Yeah.
of Jesus, but it doesn't get talked about, I don't think, nearly enough. And it's Luke chapter 7. It starts in verse 11. It's when Jesus raises a widow's son. So it's Luke 7, starts in 11. It says, soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And then the Lord Jesus saw her, and he had compassion on her, and said to her, do not weep. Then he came up and touched the bearer, and they stood still, and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Then interestingly, everybody's scared. They're like, "Oh gosh, that he raised him from the dead." But to me, that there's two beautiful things about that story. That one, in the cultural context, the widow has just lost everything. So it's actually a deeper loss than just losing your son, because a woman couldn't own property, and so. We don't really know a whole lot about whether she was wealthy or whether she wasn't wealthy, but she had one son. She was a widow, so she doesn't have a husband, and now her son being gone means that she's left with nothing. I mean, she's completely destitute. So then you have this line where it says Jesus has compassion. And what I love about the story is really goes down to that word compassion. It's a funny Greek word that's called splagnitsomai, which is not a very beautiful sounding word.
It almost sounds German.
Yeah, it's a weird word, which makes it easy to remember what you've said it a few times.
Oh yeah, sure. That's an easy to remember word.
But splagnitsomai, the literal translation of splagnitsomai in Greek is actually gut or stomach.
Oh.
And we translate it as compassion. And what's cool about the word compassion in the Greek is in the New Testament, I think it's only in the New Testament about 14 times. 8 of the times that we see that word in the New Testament, it is either being used to describe Jesus, such as this passage, that he has compassion, or it's being used by Jesus. So the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan, it says that he has compassion on him. Mm-hmm. So Jesus uses the word, or it's describing Jesus, but it's not a very common word.
Right.
But the idea is that his gut feels something. And anytime we see compassion, it's not just a feeling, there's also a response. So the Good Samaritan responds by helping the person that he sees beat up on the side of the road. And in this story, Jesus, it's not just that he feels bad for the woman, that he feels it in his gut, and it leads him to respond. And I think, especially for someone who's a listener that has maybe a negative view of Jesus, or just a negative view of God, this idea that God's throwing lightning bolts, the Jesus that we see, the character, the nature of God that we see revealed to us in Scripture in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, is a God that has compassion. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
You know, it's interesting, the word compassion, because I'm kind of recalling here that the idea of compassion, it really wasn't common in that time period. You talked about this last week, that it was really more an honor and shame society. Mm-hmm. And so there was this give and take. You do something for me, I do something for you. But here we see Jesus doing something just out of compassion, out of love and kindness. And so it feels to me like this is something new, something that perhaps wasn't as prevalent then in the culture. And he's demonstrating something that we all need, and we all need to give people as well. In the NIV version, it says, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. And I love, just as you were saying, that feeling that he needed to help her. And also it says, don't cry. Yours said what? Don't weep?
Don't
or
weep.
What is, yeah, don't weep.
Yeah, I am reading out of ESV.
Yeah.
And it says, don't weep.
Is that your favorite version, the ESV? Like, is that the one you use most often?
Bible versions is a whole different topic. My answer to people always on what's the right version of scripture to read is always a simple answer, and that is whichever one you will read.
Yeah.
I think most of them are all great. I think you've had some versions that in your spectrum, you tend to have on one end of the spectrum, you've got a paraphrase, a phrase for phrase. On the other end of the spectrum, that you've got a literal word for word. A paraphrase is going to be easier to read. Word for word is just going to be, hey, this is exactly what it's saying. And I think you got a whole spectrum. I think NIV is probably the closest to the middle, that it's still a close to word for word translation, but a little bit more phrase to phrase. Versions like NASB, New American Standard, is going to be closer to word for word, a little harder to read. ESV is going to trend that direction, but it's more modern than NASB, so it's going to be a little bit easier to read with verbiage, but it's still going to be very close to what it actually says in the Hebrew and the Greek. But I don't think
I like the response of read whatever version you're going to read. Like you're actually going to read it.
That's right. Because unless you're really getting into some type of study on one specific word, for the most part, it's not going to make a huge difference.
Yeah.
It's still conveying the heart and the why. I know some people don't like Eugene Peterson's The Message, and it's definitely not a word for word translation.
No.
But for a lot of people, that's what has made Scripture come to life, and I think that's a wonderful thing. I think the more you can spend time in the Word, the better.
Yeah. Last night in the Bible study, my nephew was there, and he was reading from the King James Version.
Oh, really?
Which is, I was like, what? There's a lot of thous and they in there. So
it's funny. There's probably 5 verses in my head, like a John 3:16, a Psalm 23, that they're all memorized in King James Version because of when I was a kid. That's how I learned it. And once you learn it in a version, it's hard to change it later on.
And I totally can see that. Like it's good that it's in your head and that you can memorize it. But so back to the story, he touches the young man, and he says, "Young man, I say to you, get up." So he gets up and he begins to talk. And I love this next phrase, and you mentioned it. Jesus gave him back to his mother.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that a beautiful sentiment? Like
he
knew, he understood everything that you were talking about, how she'd lost everything. And he gave him back to his mother, which I think that's really a beautiful sentiment. So this story about compassion, it does speak to how Jesus viewed the people when he was there. He had a lot of compassion on people the whole time he was there, right? He was healing them out of compassion and teaching them and healing them just out of compassion. We see lots of stories where he's healing and, they weren't confessing their faith in him. He was just healing them because he had compassion on the human condition.
And I think that's a real key point, because this wasn't his response to the first step being worship, or the first step being, well, because they've done so much for me, I'm responding to it. It's the idea of grace that completely undeserved on their part. They haven't done anything to deserve his compassion. That's just who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And what you hit on earlier is completely correct. Our American culture it elevates and values things like compassion, but that's true only because of the teachings of Jesus that we see 2,000 years later, that we see the teachings of Jesus, ideas and concepts like love your neighbor as yourself and the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Those were not first century mindsets. And what Jesus brought that not only just radically changed the world through Christianity, but just the teachings, the ideas that people have value and that compassion is a good thing that we should demonstrate to other people. That's uniquely from Jesus that we've seen lots of other people pick up on over the course of the centuries after Jesus, but it starts with Jesus, and that was very unique at that time.
I love it. I love that he brought that to us, because we all need compassion for each other, and we need to work on being compassionate and sharing that with our neighbors, just the people in our lives. All right, so my first story is a bigger story. I think many people probably have heard something about this story. It's the Transfiguration of Jesus. And I'm going to go in Luke's Gospel, starting in chapter 9, verse 28. And we'll walk through this story. Now, just to set the context, Jesus and his disciples had left the Galilee area and gone up north. And up north of Galilee, there's some mountains and hills. And they had already been to Caesarea Philippi, but now they continued on. And they're continuing to a mountain. We don't know exactly what mountain it is. There's not that many mountains in Israel,
Right.
so
It's one of only a handful. There's a lot of guesses, but
exactly.
there's definitely one of about 3.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe Mount Hermon, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was probably pretty close. So, in any case, the story tells us that after 8 days, or about 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James, so a smaller group, right? Who we might think would be the inside group, with him, and he went up onto a mountain to pray. Now, this is pretty common for Jesus, isn't it? They're going to a mountain to pray.
Sure. Yeah, one of the regular habits and routines is that sometimes at the times when it seems the oddest that he would do it, like the crowd gets really pressed up against him, and he's at kind of the height of this frenzy, and in the middle of that, what does he do? He stops, he retreats away, and he spends time up on the mountain praying.
Yeah. I mean, how should we look at that? Like, we're not going to go to a mountain, but can we visualize a mountain where we're going to go pray? Like, think
sure.
of it as
I think Jesus demonstrates, obviously we're not Jesus, and he demonstrates in that combination of his deity and his humanity being both simultaneous. I think on the humanity side, he's trying to demonstrate to us the importance and the value of not just rest and resting the right way, but
right.
this reliance on God. And probably the most famous of all those passages is in Mark 1, where it says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, went to a solitary place where he prayed. And Jesus often goes up a mountain. Most of us don't have a mountain in our backyard that we can just say, well, I'm going up the mountain this morning. But what you see in Mark 1:32 is this idea that he's going to a solitary place. So it's a place where you think in our context, that's probably less about being around other people and more about just putting away distractions. How can I be alone? And then it's really about prayer. I think for us, spending time in Scripture and reading God's Word is a part of that as well. But man, with as busy as life gets and with as distracting as technology can be, moments of solitude add a lot of value where we can just recenter and refocus. And I think Jesus does it because there's value for him in doing it. But I also think that he's doing it because he's demonstrating to us that this should be a part of our life. This should be how we live.
I mean, he wanted that connection with his Father, so he would seek it out. Mm-hmm. And they would have their conversation, and he would be praying for whatever was to come. And so as we continue, it says, as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Which that's a very strong visual image, right? Like, he just is illuminated, right? He's just like a beam of light.
And that's where we get the name Transfiguration from. It's funny because we've added this really fancy sounding name to this experience. But really all it means is that his physical self changes, that he's transfigured, that the figure of what he looks like gets transformed for this moment that looks totally different. And it's exactly what you just said, that his clothes are dazzling white and his face changes. And you can imagine for his 3 close disciples, they're like, what is going on right now?
What's going on? But don't you think this is how he looks in heaven? I mean, that's kind of how I picture it. Like, this is his heavenly being.
Yeah, I think the idea is that divine nature is being revealed in his appearance. And for the 3 disciples, it's this revelation that Jesus is just showing them, this is who I am. And we see that there's a lot of symbolism of what comes next and what the message means and what the revelation for them, what their takeaway should be.
I love it. So, all right, so continuing on, it says 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. So why those two men, Moses and Elijah? Curt?
So it's speculative, but what most scholars would say is what they represent. And what Moses represents is that he's representing the law, and
Mhm.
what Elijah represents is that he's representing the prophets. So the representation is that Jesus is the fulfillment from the Old Testament of Moses, of the law, but also from the Old Testament of all the prophecies about the Messiah that would come. So those two key figures that represent, if you're looking in the Old Testament for a first century Jew and you were thinking of who's the Mount Rushmore, the most key figures, they're at the top. And so not only are these key figures, they both represent something very, very important in the Old Testament. And it's not an accident that those are the two that are there present to reveal who Jesus is. And I love the phrase that it says that they appear in glory. We don't really know what that means, but you can imagine that they don't just look like you and I look right now. Like there is something about them that is staggering for those disciples. There's something about them that leaves this awe and grandeur. And that's part of that messaging that Jesus is using this moment for a revelation of his character, of his identity, of who he is.
Well, I want to have glorious splendor when I'm in heaven as well. But here they're talking to Jesus, and they are talking about his departure. So what do you think they're talking about? I find this to be fascinating. Do you think they're encouraging him? This is a pivotal moment. He's about to begin the hardest part of his ministry. What do you think they're saying to him?
It's a good question. It's all speculation. We don't really know.
Yes, but we don't know.
I think what it does point to is this idea that the cross, it was always the plan. The cross wasn't some accidental backup parachute of, oh gosh, we don't know what we're doing, so I guess we'll just have to go to plan B or plan C. And I think Moses and Elijah being present and talking about that is this picture that, hey, even back, I mean, you go all the way to the very beginning of Genesis, that Jesus was always the plan. And not only was he always the plan, that the cross was always the plan. That was always God's divine redemptive act that was going to restore our relationship to him. And I think that now it's this moment where that's very, very close, that they're not far
Very
away
close.
From that.
Yeah.
And they're there. It is some combination of this anticipation that this thing that has
excitement, right?
Excitement. It's finally here, but probably there is some encouragement because there is a weight and there is a heaviness that Jesus is about to endure. And
he's fully human, so he's feeling the things that we might understand for him to feel, and they're there. I like that it's a bit of both. And now Peter comes into the story.
It's always Peter with some knee-jerk reaction.
This is an interesting one, though. So Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but now they were fully awake. They saw his glory and the two men standing with him. Now, as the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. So what's Peter's mindset here? He's excited,
that phrase
right?
is common of Peter. He did not know what he was saying, and he just spoke anyway, which is the great part because it's relatable. I mean, if you're in the same situation, you're just so in awe and shock, and you see the very human response to a very big divine revelation and a divine moment that he's thinking, oh, I mean, if you've got 2 guests that show up out of nowhere, your natural response is, oh, hey, we got to give you food and we got to give you water and we got to build you a shelter. And so I think really that's what you see in Peter. You just see the very practical human response of, oh, these 2 really important people show up and he's a fisherman and his knee jerk is, I guess I got to build him a tent. And so let me get working. So I think it was his tangible response of, okay, what can I do? How can I help in this moment?
Right.
And that's where his mind went.
Well, maybe he's also thinking, hey, we're going to hang out all day. Like, we're all going to be here,
Mm,
and they'll need a place to stay as we're hanging out. And this, you're right. This is what can I do for these men who've shown up. I'm sure he knew who they were. And one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. But the fact that they are willing to say he did not know what he was saying, this kind of speaks to what you talked about last time about how we have these awkward sentences, awkward phrases in the text that reveal to us that what is being said had to be true because they're revealing something here that's not too flattering
mm.
about Peter, right?
Especially since Peter, so the Gospels are written not too long after Jesus, but you've got a strong oral tradition, and then the actual fragments that we see start getting passed around. It's probably 30-ish years after Jesus's death and resurrection. But by that time, Jesus is the leader of the early church and the Christian movement is Peter. I mean, Peter is one of the guys. You've got James, the brother of Jesus. This is one of those guys that you see. John is also one of those guys. Paul emerges pretty quickly. But if you were going to point to one person who was the right-hand guy of Jesus, it'd be Peter. And if you think of how most movements work, the leader of the movement, you try and raise that person up and make them look as great and awesome and perfect as you possibly can. And they don't do that about Peter. They as opposed to just talking about how awesome and amazing Peter is, you see over and over and over again the failures and the doubts and the human, he didn't know what to say, and so he says this or does this. And why is that there? Well, it's there because it actually happened. It's there because they're not trying to create a falsehood around the person and the identity of Peter to raise him up, because the movement didn't need that. The movement wasn't based off of how cool or how great the leadership was. It was based off of the person, the identity of Jesus and what Jesus actually did. And so that's what's unique about the Gospels is they're not trying to make all the key leaders look great. They're just
they're not perfect by any means.
They're not perfect.
I love how they keep it in there so that we get these snippets into
This
Peter's
is what actually
personality.
happened. Like why include that in Transfiguration? Well, it's because that's what Peter said. that's
But
why.
I do love Peter's heart here. Like, he's thinking this is a good thing, right? Like,
oh sure,
he wants to be helpful. So I love that he's trying to find a way to express his joy and happiness of being here. But while he's talking, goes on to say, a cloud appeared and covered them. And now they were afraid because they're all in this cloud. And the voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen. So this is the second time we hear from God, the voice of God in the cloud. The first time is at his baptism. And now we hear again from God. And he says something similar, but he adds something unique, right? He says, "This is my son, whom I have chosen." But he adds this phrase, "Listen to him." Kind of a specific statement there.
Mm-hmm.
And a good statement that we all need to take to heart, right? God is there with him as this is happening. He speaks to them, and then the cloud disappears and Jesus is alone. So I think the disciples must have been so in awe of what was going on. They were afraid, they were in awe, they were trying to figure out what to do. It's really a big moment for them, but it's definitely a moment when I think they fully realized who Jesus was at this point, at this moment.
Mm-hmm. That word "listen to" in the Greek, it starts to change a little bit, and definitely in English we think of it very different. But in Hebrew, the Shema, which is a prayer that Hebrews pray every single day, it starts with that word, listen. Listen, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. But in Hebrew, what's interesting about the word "listen" is that there's not a Hebrew word for obey. So listen encompasses this idea of not just hearing something, but responding to it as well. So listen in the Old Testament with Hebrew, it tends to be what we would connect with obey. That it's deeper than just hearing something or what we think of as listening something. It's absorbing something and responding to it.
Yeah.
And so I think for those three, for John and for Peter and for James, hearing this idea of listening to him, it comes obviously after this dramatic moment where you've got Moses and you've got Elijah and you've got Jesus is glowing and he looks different. And you have the voice of God saying that this is my chosen one. And so then when God says, listen to him, I do think that the idea of that phrase, listen to him, is more meaningful and deeper than just, hey, hear what he's saying to you.
Yeah.
It is something deeper of, I've revealed to you who Jesus is. Now the expectation is that you need to respond to that. And that response isn't just listening to his teachings. It's transforming
It's obeying
who you
what he's
are.
saying.
Yeah, it's absolutely obeying.
I mean, this whole image of like heaven coming down to earth and touching earth, and here's Moses, here's Elijah, here's Jesus, and they're seeing this, where the veil between heaven and earth has been lifted, and they're all there together, and now God is there too. It is a quite dramatic and big moment, and they would never have forgotten it. So it kind of fuels their fire for doing what they did once Jesus was resurrected and ascended back into heaven. They were energized by this, and they understood that their mission was incredibly important. So that's my story. Love that story. What's your next story?
Also in Luke, but at the very end of Luke, in Luke chapter 24. So this is the famous exchange starting in verse 13. It's the famous exchange after the resurrection. So Jesus has died on the cross. He's raised from the dead. And then the whole road to Emmaus account, which we won't read the entire thing because it's long. But the road to Emmaus account is this. It's wacky in some ways because there's things that we see about Jesus that are different than probably we'd expect of if just a normal person died and rose from the dead. But we call it to the road to Emmaus conversation, where he shows up to these followers of himself, of Jesus. But what's unique and interesting about the conversation is they don't recognize him. Yeah. And we don't know why. The resurrected body of Jesus often behaves and acts and looks different than what we would expect it to. And so there's something about the resurrected body of Jesus that he has an ability to let people know who he is, where they see him and they recognize him. And then he also has the ability to not let people know.
I mean, that happens with Mary at the tomb, right? I mean, the same thing.
It happens multiple times where you'd see this person who knows Jesus really, really well, and they don't recognize who he is. And then all of a sudden, and nothing seems to change, but he just decides to reveal, hey, I'm now going to allow you to know who I am, and now all of a sudden they do know who he is. That's so there's some odd things that happen with the resurrected body that are just kind of interesting. Some of it is actually kind of comical. There's a sense of humor that I think sometimes we look past, that Jesus clearly has with his disciples and how he interacts with them and how he talks with them. I think the road to Emmaus is a good example of that, because it's like the whole time he's just kind of joking with them, because he shows up and he basically asks about himself. He says, hey, has anything been happening in Jerusalem? And they're looking at him right after the death and the resurrection. They're like, where have you been? Like, have you missed the big news that Jesus of Nazareth has been crucified? I mean, so Jesus is just kind of joking with him. And then he has a long conversation because they're walking down this whole road. And then he reveals who he is at the very end and then disappears. And I think it's just, I like to think that Jesus is chuckling as he does it, because you have this kind of reveal moment and then whoop, he's gone. And you see a lot of that with Jesus.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. He says, what are you discussing together as you walk along? What are you talking about?
Right. Well, and then you see the response there in verse 18. They say, are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened in these days? And obviously Jesus does know. Jesus is the one that lived it. And he's just kind of joking with him. He's just kind of messing around, because even then he doesn't respond with, "Oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about." He responds with, "What things?" And so
Yeah.
he's still just kind of egging them on. And the thing I love about the exchange is one, I do think you see this sense of humor in Jesus that is just fun loving, and fun loving after a pretty heavy thing. I mean,
Yeah.
he just he just had the crucifixion happen to him, and
Yes.
you could imagine that the toll that would take on anybody, and yet. Now you see a resurrected Jesus that is just so full of life and joy and humor with it. That you see the same thing with the resurrected Jesus when he shows up to the upper room, because it sets the stage where they're all scared and they're all kind of freaked out. And then instead of Jesus knocking on the door, he emerges through the wall, and they
Yes.
all think he's a ghost. And I think he's just messing with him. I mean, could he have done it a different way that doesn't freak him out? Sure, he could have, but
Yeah.
he chooses to do it that way. And I think it's because these are his best friends that he's done life with for the last few years, and now he's kind of pranking them.
Yeah, he does it when
Um,
he's walking on the water to the boat, right? As well.
right,
Like
right. He does the same
they
thing.
think he's a ghost, and then they realize who he is. So I think you're right. I like the idea that, well, he's just showing himself in different ways to
Right.
them and helping them to understand who he is. But
And
I
the
like,
cool part about the whole exchange is
yeah,
I think this exchange, the why that it's in there is that it helps connect the dot from the very beginning of Scripture all the way up to the life of Jesus, who Jesus is, and then everything going forward. And you see that in verses 25, 26, and 27, where he says to them, "O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." This connects back to Transfiguration. That why is Elijah there at Transfiguration? Because it's
yeah.
this idea that all the things that the prophets have spoken about were really a revelation about who Jesus is. And so
Mhm.
Jesus is picking up on that idea. And then verse 26, he says, "Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" The followers of Jesus at the time, they didn't fully grasp and understand the cross and the why. And so now Jesus is saying, "Hey, this was always the plan."
Yeah.
And you see this throughout the Gospels. The whole time they thought that Jesus was going to become the king over Rome, and he
Yeah.
was going to become an emperor, and that he would elevate them up, and that he was going to be this warrior. And Jesus over and over again says, "Hey, my kingdom's going to look very different than that." But they had selective hearing because they thought the best thing for them would be that Jesus becomes an emperor. And now Jesus is saying, "No, the whole time, always the point was the cross." And then in verse 27, I think it's one of the most important verses in all of Scripture that helps us understand that it is one story. It's the 66 different books that we can look at and say, well, they're all isolated, but this helps tie it all together, because it says, talking about Jesus, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself. And that's that
Wow. I
revelation.
would have liked to have been in that
Oh,
conversation,
right.
right?
The downside is we don't have what he says. So, so he leaves us this these breadcrumbs to say, hey, the Old Testament, there is a foreshadowing about the person of Jesus in every story, in every book, and really every chapter. We call it the scarlet thread. That there's a scarlet
Oh,
thread
I
that
love
ties
that.
Jesus from the very beginning of Scripture all the way to the book of the Revelation at the very end. And Jesus could have said, "And let me show you," and that could be what Luke 24 is filled with. But
Yeah.
instead, he doesn't. And I think it's one of the exciting things as Christians. It gives us a chance to say, okay, we know from Jesus that all scriptures and all things he's helping interpret it back to himself. So we know it's there, but he's putting the emphasis on us to go back and understand those things, and
Yeah.
find those things and look for those things. And it's a beautiful thing. Going back to this idea of spending time separate and by ourselves and in solitude. This is one of the things that we should be and could be searching for in those moments of helping
Yeah.
understand, how is the redemptive story of the Bible, all one story that is uniquely knitted together, revealing the identity, the character, the nature of Jesus.
I love that. I like the fact that they were so excited about the conversation that they basically made him stay for dinner. Like, come on, come and have dinner with us because we want to talk some more. He takes the bread and he breaks it. And then he hands them the bread and their eyes were open. Like,
right.
This is the moment they realize who he is.
Right. It's kind of crazy because he's just done what you've got to imagine is a pretty long and thorough explanation of the entire Old Testament concerning
that
the
would
person
take some time, right?
of Jesus. And so it's not like they've been with him for 2 minutes. They've been with him for a long time. And then they sit down and then they're having, and you got to wonder who they think he is at this point. They got to think, man, this is a smart stranger. It's funny, and you see it really throughout Scripture that Jesus, with a lot of his ministry, you see two things happening. You see rest and sleep, and you see food. And Jesus' ministry is filled with food, and this moment, this reveal moment, it connects to it. And when he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them, and their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And then again, going back to the kind of the humor side. So the moment they recognize who he is, the very next line is, and he vanished from their sight. And he's just gone. Like the moment they're like, oh, hey, it's Jesus. Like, surely there's a lot of questions now that we know that it's you, but he doesn't give them that luxury. He just disappears, probably with a chuckle.
He probably like, I already answered all your questions. Yep. So it's time for me to leave. Heading out now. Bye.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I love that story. That was a great way to walk through it, thinking about the men and what they must have felt as they were going along. So the last story we're going to talk about is Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Like your story, it's a bit long, but I love this story because it too shows us the humanity of Jesus. Obviously, Jesus loved this family, right? He loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Whenever he was in the area, he would stay in Bethany with them. I think we understand that they're not married, so they're living in the house together. And so they're his friends. They are his pals. I get the idea that when they're together, they're eating and having a good time and talking. They're his followers, but they're also his friends. Now, Lazarus becomes ill, and Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, send word to Jesus. He's about 90 miles away, so it takes the messengers 2 days to get there. And when they get the message, he gets the message, and the message is starting in chapter 11 of John 11, verse 1, starting there. So the sisters sent word to Jesus and they said, Lord, the one you love is sick. So here we see how much Jesus cares for this family, the one you love. And when Jesus heard this, he said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. And then it tells us, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Now, that would not be the response that we would expect Jesus to have, is it?
Mm-hmm.
We would think he'd be like...
I think they've seen... At this point, they've seen Jesus do a lot of miracles. They've seen him do some amazing things. And so you definitely, from the human side, what do Mary and Martha, what are they thinking? They're thinking, okay, all we got to do is we got to send a message to Jesus, and we've got a great relationship with him. He's healing strangers. Of course he's going to come here heal Lazarus.
Right.
And the disciples probably assume the same thing. As soon as they get it, they're probably like, all right, pack it up. Let's go. And then Jesus does something that feels very odd. He says, hey, we're going to sit tight for another 2 days. And to your point, that the 2 days is a significant number because that's how long it would have taken him to get there. And it's kind of the point of it is it's telling us that, hey, if he would have wanted to be there before Lazarus died, he could have gotten there. But he's choosing not to.
Yeah. You're right. And then he says to the disciples, let's go back to Judea. And they say, hey, wait a minute, Rabbi. A short while ago, the Jews were trying to stone you there. Remember, just in chapter 10, they were trying to stone you and they wanted to kill you. And now you want to go back there? Are you sure? Like, should we go back there? And Jesus responds, talking about his work. Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when people walk at night that they will stumble, for they have no light. What's he saying there? What do you think he's saying there?
I think it's again this picture, this revelation of who he is. I mean, you see him talk a lot about in this idea that Jesus is the light of the world. And you have this passage that's happening right before he's going to reveal to them, hey, Lazarus is dead.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a truth of the brokenness that exists in this world. Death is a revelation of that. No matter what you think about God, or whether someone's an atheist or they don't believe in afterlife, there is something broken about death. And anybody who has ever sat through a funeral can feel that and know that.
Right.
And it doesn't feel normal or natural. And I think that's the reality of a fallen and broken world. We live in this darkness, but there is this hope that Jesus is this light. And I think this is this hinting ahead of who he is and also what he's about to do.
And John is very good at these big themes like this, right? These contrasts of darkness and light, love and hate, belief and unbelief. He likes that way of looking at things. But so they wait a little longer, and finally Jesus says to them in 14, so then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let's go to him. So now they go, and they're a little ways out of Bethany. And Jesus realizes, now he knows that Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days, which I think means it's like a reference that he was fully dead. Like 4 days is the number, right? In the Jewish culture where you're not coming back, or I don't know, is 3 like maybe you would, and 4 like for sure you're not. But it has
there's
some
definitely some symbolism in the number in the Old Testament with that number 3 of this idea that it took 3 days to walk that path into the afterlife, and so there's some symbolism and some picture with that number that isn't a biblical thing as much as it's a cultural thing at the time. So it's this idea that hey, if you lived in the first century, when someone died, it took them 3 days to fully depart. And by waiting 4 days, Jesus is leaving no doubt that it's not like Lazarus. He just fell asleep and he was in a coma, and Jesus is about to pop him out of the coma. Jesus wants to make it exactly what you said, very clear that he's not just dead. He's dead. He is fully and completely gone.
He's dead. So they're ways out, and they're ways out from the tomb, and they're ways out from Mary and Martha's house. So Martha comes out, and she says to Jesus in verse 21, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. So she's beginning with like, oh, if you'd only come earlier, he wouldn't have even died, right? But still, I believe in you, and God will give you whatever you ask. So she's expressing her belief, but also a little bit of disappointment, as makes sense that she would be expressing some disappointment. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And she says, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her these beautiful words, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And he asked her directly, do you believe this? Which I think is, I don't know, I just love that he asked her directly. And she says, oh, yes, I believe that. So then Mary comes in the picture and they have a similar discussion. And after the discussion, Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who had come along with her weeping. And this is in verse 33. And he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And he says, "Where have you laid him?" Again, this strong picture of Jesus in a moment of sorrow. And they take him there, and we have now the shortest verse in the Bible, right? Verse 35, Jesus wept. So why is he crying here? I mean, there's probably several reasons, but why do you think he's weeping?
I think that's that compassionate side of who Jesus is. He obviously knows what's about to happen, so he knows why he let Lazarus die. He knows that he's going to raise him from the dead, and yet simultaneously that doesn't remove the pain that exists with death. And so he's had this conversation with Martha, who he loves, and he sees the grief and the pain and the turmoil in Martha, and now he's having this conversation with Mary, and he's just seen the absolute devastation. And if you've walked alongside a friend or a loved one, or you yourself that have lost someone very dear to you, you know that anguish.
You do.
And I think it's interesting just how life works. Rarely do we relate to someone's successes. So you don't tend to look at a Bill Gates or a Jeff Bezos and say, oh, I know exactly how he feels being worth $150 billion. But when we see people go through tragedy, if you have experienced tragedy, that is a much more relatable thing. And that's not to say that all pain is the same, because I think pain is unique, but really deep, painful experiences resonate if you've had a similar, really deep, painful experience. And I think it's all of that Jesus is seeing and feeling and experiencing. That's true. It's not the God's will that he's about to accomplish through Lazarus does not take away the pain that was very real pain that was experienced as a result of his death and loss. And I think
I
you
agree.
see that. And then
I think it's not just the pain of that death, but it's probably he's weeping over the human condition, that death is a part of our journey now. He's weeping over the people who do not believe, the unbelievers, and sadness about that. I think he could be weeping over what's going to happen to Israel. Just a few decades later, the temple is destroyed. So he's just grieving over the brokenness of the world, and then experience it in such a personal way with his friend. It's really a beautiful moment. And the Jews said, see how he loved him. So it moves to Jesus actually raising Lazarus from the dead. Now, Jesus says, take away the stone. And what does Martha say? Our sister, who's very focused on the details. She says, Lord, if you take away the stones, there will be a bad odor. So she's worried about logistically what's going to happen. Right. And Jesus is like, I don't think we have to worry about that.
And what's interesting is earlier, the way the text reads makes it feel like Martha says, if you would have been here, he could have been healed. And you are still one who can do whatever you want, whatever you ask of God. And yet, you look at what happens after that with Martha. And even though she says, hey, whatever you ask, you can do it because of who you are, it's still the furthest in her mind that's not raise Lazarus from the dead.
Right.
Well, that's an impossibility that will not happen. And you really see it in that line where if she in her mind was like, oh, well, now Jesus can raise him from the dead, then she'd be like, okay, yeah, let's roll it.
Yeah, let's get that stone out. Right.
But that is not even in the realm of possibility to her, which is why she's like, hey, listen, this is not going to be a good thing. We need to leave that there. And
I mean, that is surprising. You're right. Like, you have to move the stone for Lazarus to be raised from the dead. So that's an excellent point. So Jesus goes on to say, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And after they remove the stone in verse 41, he looks up and he says, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you will always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. I love this very public prayer that Jesus says to his Father. I also love the fact that he says that you have heard me, and I knew that you always hear me. It makes me feel like he always hears me, too, which we need to feel assured that God hears us, our prayers. And then he follows up with Lazarus come out, and Lazarus comes out, and the community gathers around him and takes off the grave clothes and let him go. And now here's Lazarus fully alive, which would have been a sight to see for sure. Like, I'm sure people were just like
definitely a moment.
Like he's saying, Lazarus come out, and everybody's like holding their breath. Well, what's going to happen?
Right, for a moment, everybody's like, wait, why is he rolling away the stone? And then when he makes that proclamation, I mean, you've got to imagine that it's not like 2 seconds later that Lazarus is outside the tomb. I don't know how long it takes Lazarus from the moment that he is raised from the dead to get up and walk out. So whether it's 5 seconds or 35 seconds or 90 seconds, that's a long, dramatic pause, however long it takes. Because
like
you got to imagine
the most
people
pause
think,
of the world, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's some amount of skepticism that people are like, what is this crazy guy doing? Like, there's no way that Lazarus is coming out.
What does he think's going to happen?
And then you can just imagine the moment. You can imagine the moment that he actually does walk out. And it's interesting in the story, the narrative around Jesus. This is a big moment, not just from the theological standpoint of who it reveals Jesus to be, and it shows the divinity of God because he has power over death. It shows the humanity of God because he has this compassion where he's weeping. But in this story, it's a really pinnacle moment because it's the moment that causes Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Pharisees to say, hey, we've got to do something about this guy. Which the irony is you'd think that the opposite would happen. You'd think they'd say, well, man, this guy that we've been persecuting and hating, he just raised someone from the dead. We need to back up and really try and examine who is this guy. But instead, this is a moment where so many people now hear about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead that it's what causes Palm Sunday to be Palm Sunday. You now have this fervor that's been building around Jesus, but the religious leaders take it as a threat. And so this moment was a big moment theologically. It's a big moment storyline-wise, but it's a big moment in the narrative as well because it changes the direction of what is happening in Jesus's life, and it definitely is this starting point of from this moment to the cross, that the cross now becomes inevitable. There's no way in the storyline where that's not going to happen.
Well, they were corrupt. They were focusing on their own power. I mean, the fact that they didn't really want to discuss or refute the fact that he's doing the miracles, but instead they just want to figure out how to get rid of him, just really speaks to what was in their hearts. They didn't really care that it was the truth. Right. But we care that it's the truth. So,
right. And yet God was using it. I mean, that's the sovereign side of God is that there's an interesting, I think right after this, there's a phrase from Caiaphas where he says, better for one to die than the entire nation. And what he's talking about is, this fear that you'd had multiple movements of Jewish leaders that had caused the Roman government to come and crush them. And I think there's this fear from Caiaphas of, okay, you've got this really charismatic person that's doing all these things. There's going to be a giant revolt. They're going to revolt against Rome, and then Rome is going to come and crush us. Right. And so that's where he says that phrase. But in that phrase, there's also this prophecy about Jesus that's exactly what Jesus would do, just not in the way they expected.
Yeah. I mean, he's prophesying, but it's actually the truth, just not in the way that he thought. He thought we'll just get rid of them and then we'll all be united. Right. He had the right thought, but he did not have the right scenario in mind as to how it was going to happen. So,
because exactly what he said is what happened.
exactly.
But he thought he was trying to save the Jewish nation, and really Jesus was saving everybody. It was a much bigger thing, and that was God's plan the whole time.
Yeah. Well, I loved our conversation today. Thank you so much for taking the time to share.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's always fun.
It's been great. And again, I want to encourage people, as you said, to read the stories about Jesus. I want to encourage people to just, look at how much he loved us, everything he did, and how we should love him as well for what he did. I'm grateful that we have this time together. I love starting the morning talking about Jesus. It's just a great way to start the day.
It's hard to beat.
It's hard to beat. So I look forward to our next conversation. And, have a great day, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you. Appreciate it.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.